Hi, everybody. Super excited to bring you the next episode of History 102, that being on ancient Europe with our new host, Austin Paget.
Hello. Time to take a dive to the real past.
I like that this show talks about ancient history because one of the worst trends in historiography, and for those that don't know, historiography is the art of studying history, which is a field that's basically only useful to people like me. Historiography is just historians either masturbating to themselves or actually trying to figure out the biases they have. Um, and it's 90% first and 10% the latter. And historiography, oftentimes every single history starts with the Battle of Thermopylae, where every single history of blank will start with the Greco-Persian Wars, um, where your histories of democracy, your histories of philosophy, your histories of warfare, and people. I have several gripes with it. One is that we don't appreciate the Mesopotamians enough, because keep in mind we are on civilizational cycle three. Cycle one is the Bronze Age world that culminates in the Bronze Age collapse. Cycle two culminates in the fall of Rome. Cycle three culminates in Mouse Utopia. There was probably another cycle beforehand with Çatalhöyük and stuff being part of that. Samo talks about that more. But we never think about the first cycle, but history is so much older than we think. And also, there's basically no interest in the indigenous inhabitants of Europe, even among Europeans, where you read European histories, and it's a very Mediterranean centric worldview, where if you read Victorian authors, you could very easily forget that these are people of almost entirely Celtic and German heritage because they talk about their entire heritage stemming from Greece and Israel or the Mediterranean. And I have said beforehand that I think there's three people talk about Athens and Jerusalem being instrumental to the creation of Western civilization, and I'm going to add a third, the Sund. And the Sund is the area where Denmark meets Sweden, and it was called the Fountain of Nations by Tacitus, or the Roman author, who said that 20 different aggressive Germanic peoples came from this area of Denmark. And I think as much of our culture comes from the Sund as from Jerusalem or Athens. And when you look at the cultures of these indigenous prehistoric Europeans, they exist today because it's our culture. And this is one of the things the right is getting more so into. And I'd like to make a video about this so that there can be something on this topic that's not made by fascists.
Was Tolkien interested in the old roots of Europe, and did he
Oh,
try
of
and incorporate
course.
that into his Lord of the Rings mythology,
Yeah.
right? That was kind of the point of it.
Yeah, that was his whole John. Like he said that the English didn't have a national epic because in the medieval era, every single country in Europe except the English had a national epic. The English got co-opted by King Arthur, which was a Welsh national epic. The French, Germans, Italians had the Charlemagne cycles. The Spanish had El Cid. The Scandinavians and the Germans had Siegfried. And the Russians had Vladimir the Great, and the English didn't have one, or the Anglo-Saxons. And so Tolkien's great mission was to establish Anglo-Saxon mythology, and his speciality was Anglo-Saxon and Norse history. And I've read basically the entire corpus on Norse mythology because it's like 300 pages. Every single primary source in Norse mythology is 300 pages added up together. And for example, Gandalf is a name for Odin, and you'll see like Yomer is a character in Beowulf. Frodo is a character in Beowulf. So he was pulling very deeply upon it. And if you watch my video on Lord of the Rings, you'll find that Tolkien was pulling on a combination of Celtic, Norse, and Finnish mythology. Elvish is based off Finnish, and there's lots of references to the Kalevala, or the Finnish folk epic, where Lord of the Rings is a culmination of the indigenous folk traditions of North Europe.
Yes, that makes sense. And that hasn't been explored by too many figures since Tolkien,
No,
really. So,
it became socially taboo. The the Nazis tried to do it, but I will always so as a conservative, people often assume I am more psychologically close to being a Nazi than I am, and Nazis and me will often pick often similar topics, but view them in completely different ways. So I made a video of Aryans, I've made videos of the indigenous inhabitants of North Europe. I see whenever Nazis touch a topic, they pervert it. Where an example of this is the Nazis said that the Germans could conquer the Slavs because the Slavs are more Aryan. The reality is that when we sequenced Aryan ancestry, Slavs are actually more Aryan than Germans are. The genetic differences between Poles and Germans are pretty small. And you find with a lot of stuff like this where politics will authoritarian politics colors intellectual discovery in a way that will always taint it.
Right, which is why it's important that people like us jump into the space and talk about it.
Yeah.
And it also produced something pretty awesome through Lord of the Rings, so there's got to be
Yeah,
something cool there.
exactly. I really dislike that the Nazis say that the culmination of the Nordic tradition is Nazism, because you look at the Nordic tradition, it is heroic individualism. It's men like Siegfried or men like Cuchulainn who were just Chads who made their own way, and they were people who if the government needed Cuchulainn to die for him, he would say no because he believed in freedom. And totalitarianism is not the end point of the innate European tradition, it's
Right.
freedom. And so the place I'll start with talking about this topic is that we've had to pull out a lot of negative psychological pins from the 20th century. The 20th century had all these negative psychological and anthropological and historic conventions that really destroyed how we process the ancient world or the prehistoric world. And this is something I can't overstate, where an example of this is the common thesis over the 20th century that you were never allowed to question in academia was that tribal peoples and prehistoric peoples did not wage war and they did not migrate. This is so wrong. Where tribal peoples lose between 20 to 40% of their male population each generation in warfare. And this is one of the really big points that made it difficult to study ancient Europe because ancient Europe saw so much genocide. It was such a violent society. Ice Age Europe saw 7 different waves of genocide just during the Ice Age. It's different genetic populations. My father's Y chromosome, though, is the first indigenous inhabitants of Europe who came here 50,000 years ago. So I am the Native American of Europe. Although
And is that from the Irish? Because don't Irish have a higher percent of Mesozoic
my dad's
European?
ancestry is all Irish, except for, or it's basically 100% Irish, but my Y chromosome, or father's father, he was a Norwegian guy who moved to Yorkshire, who fled to Ireland during the English Civil War and basically bedded a local Irish girl. And that ancestry is Lap in origin, because the people with the most indigenous European ancestry are the Scandinavians.
And is that specifically the northern Scandinavians or just
Yeah.
in, okay, in general? And then I guess what would be the other high points of really, really indigenous, like pre-Anatolian, pre-Indo-European genetics in Europe? Would that be like Basque
Yeah,
area, Ireland, up in Scandinavia, and then a little around Lithuania?
Kevin McDonald covers this. So Western hunter-gatherer ancestry or the pre-agricultural ancestry is like 10% of West Europe's population. It concentrates the further west you get. And that's like Ireland, France. So the only non-Aryan speaking language in Europe is the Basques, but we've done genetic sequences on the Basques, and they're genetically identical to everyone around them, which is disappointing.
Oh,
You're
really?
hoping, yeah, no, they're completely identical to the Spanish and the French. We think they just happen to have a ruling class that survived because they actually do have Aryan ancestry. And you think of like all of the historical complexities of the last 200 years, and then you imagine trying to figure out the historical complexities of 5,000 years ago. Because how would you explain to someone why there are so many Italians in New York? Because it doesn't make sense geographically. How come genetically there's the cluster of Italians in New York and a handful of neighboring cities and nowhere else? And it's because that was a region that economically was very important at the time, while the rest of the country was less so. And so it congregated Italians at that very specific moment. And I imagine magnify that by 100 million with the ancient world,
Right.
where a really, really based example of this is that during the spread of agriculture in Europe 7,000 years ago, and agriculture came up from the Middle East, and it was a genocidal process where the Anatolian farmer populations genocided the local hunter-gatherers, where it's almost impossible to get agriculture to spread without genocide. It's really difficult to get a hunter-gatherer population to
Right.
organically adapt to agriculture. And the spread of agriculture was a really bloody process that took thousands of years because the agriculturalists eventually won because they had the numeric superiority. Yet at the same time, the hunter-gatherers had a really stark military advantage. And populations with more hunter-gatherer or herder ancestry even today are militarily more effective. West Europeans are one of the urban populations with the least farmer ancestry. And I imagine that probably creates a lot of the individualism or warrior ethic of those societies. But there was 7,000 years ago a hunter-gatherer confederacy that formed in Scandinavia that launched an offensive war hundreds of miles, genociding the farmer settlers all the way down to the Alps through Poland. And that's just so cool. And it's something you would never think about. And it was part of this total process of over the long period, the farmers completely dominated the hunter-gatherers, but you have periods like that where this single hunter-gatherer confederacy that was able to take over Scandinavia was able to launch this offensive campaign across Europe.
Right. It's like the classic fight between mountain people and farmer people in the lowlands.
Yeah, Scotland.
Yep. And it was kind of easier for the farmer people maybe to understand their lifestyle than vice versa. Like you said, if you have someone coming in competing for resources and introducing a completely different foreign style of living, um, pretty much the only end result there is going to be a lot of conflict.
Yeah. We know some of the process because we can go back through mythology, where in most world mythologies, mythology goes through certain developmental levels that you can study across the world. And there is this very common trope in mythology of the death of the Titans. And Greek mythology is the easiest example, where Kronos is this Titan god. And interestingly, in Greek mythology, the earth was a paradise under Kronos where we lived with one with nature, which was a projection of how I think farmers saw hunter-gatherers. This like race memory of when we lived with nature and didn't have to work all the time. And
Right.
Zeus killed Kronos and replaced the gods. And the idea of the new gods replacing the old gods is this archetypal story across world mythology that relates to the discovery of agriculture. And secondarily, you see with Native American cultures, there was a huge cultural jump that had to take place from first hunter-gatherers to farming, and then from village farming to commercialized agriculture. So there was this endeavor at the end of the 19th century to assimilate Native Americans to modern capitalism. And so they would give the Native Americans plows and fields, and the Native Americans refused to plow the earth because they saw it as an insult to Mother Earth. They would think that the idea of digging up the land was just morally wrong because you were killing your own mother, and they refused to do it. And it's lots of stuff like that. And just frankly, there's this whole school of philosophy recently that hunter-gatherers lived vastly better lives than later people. And that's one of those things where I'm still waiting to hear the facts people aren't saying because so much of anthropology recently is propaganda that when I hear something like that and it plays so deeply into the left's myth of the noble savage, um, because I this is a tangent of mine. We have been lied to so much about tribal peoples that it's like impossible. Where the Yanomami, as an example, people said that they were peaceful and that they were loving and that stuff, and they said they're feminist. The reality is that 40% of Yanomami men die every generation, and if a husband doesn't beat his wife until her bruises are blue, he doesn't love her in their culture. Because if your husband doesn't beat you enough, he doesn't care about you. And
Right.
so there's lots of stuff like that with tribal cultures where they say one thing and you actually study them and they're completely different. But with these sorts of transitions, farmers objectively work significantly more than hunter-gatherers do. You can't really work as a hunter-gatherer for longer than 15 hours a week. And with farmers, you're working like a full-time job at least. And so that's a really difficult jump, and people don't like doing it. And the outcome is on a collective level, not an individual level. On an individual level, you have every single incentive to be a hunter-gatherer because you have a military advantage, it's more fun, the diet's more varied, it's more in tune with human nature. And then on the collective level, your numbers swell. But a really interesting fact is that from the 5000 BC to the 10,000, 5000 BC to 10,000 BC, this was the window with the invention of agriculture, because the invention of agriculture came about due to the Younger Dryas mini ice age 10,000 years ago. And then it wasn't until like 4000, 5000 BC that you start seeing towns and the population actually increasing, because for that first 5000 years you are passing through a disease gradient, because the farming populations had to go through a period where they acclimated to their animals' diseases, because almost all diseases are from domesticated animals. And so, for example, when the Europeans discovered the New World, 90% of the natives died of disease. That was because they had never gone through that 5,000-year period of acclimating to the disease gradient that Eurasia went through. And when you study this time period, keep in mind that it wasn't until 5,000 years of basically genetic gradient that you could actually see the world's population rise due to the growth of agriculture.
Right. And I guess with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, there's also an additional flexibility. You can migrate a broad range of territory. You can kind
Exactly.
of escape situations. But once you settle down to farm, you really have to defend that land
Yes.
with everything you have. And I mean, I don't think there was anybody, if you go back 5,000 years ago, everybody who settled down to farm anywhere, their ancestors were eventually killed and kicked off the area about 20 times before we get to the modern era.
Yeah. Another thing is that from archaeological sites of ancient Europe, we find very stark population polarities. What happens is that from a Danish archaeology site as an example, we see 6 different times the population skyrockets, crashes, skyrockets again, crashes again, and it's really stark. And it's partly because it took them a long time to figure out the social technologies related to agriculture. And then also hunter-gatherers and disease. And I wonder if we're due for that in the industrial world, if there'll be as much of a period of difficult transition for the industrial age that we have to be able to adjust to just the new conditions.
And what would that be? Diseases, psychological?
It
I mean,
could
was
be a
it mostly
variety of
diseases
things.
for
It
them?
could be mouse for us or for them.
For them first.
Okay, for them it was disease, it was external war, it was famine, it was climate change, probably stuff we don't even know about, like cultural breakdowns, or this was when social hierarchies started to get bigger. And so I'd imagine that they might have gone through a communist phase where as social hierarchies got bigger, you would relapse onto more egalitarian hunter-gatherer norms, and then that doesn't work, and then so you have to let more hierarchy, then it gets too bad, etc.
Right. I'm sure it was really sloppy and volatile at first. Like
Yeah.
the first farming in Mesopotamia, I'd like to imagine they should do a series about it because imagine you're just living a lifestyle that's consistent for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Then someone just starts to decide to dig irrigation channels
Yeah.
and you aren't at the mercy of the riverbank and you can expand a ridiculous amount. All of a sudden, there's all this wealth and material, and then there's some people in charge that want to take credit for it, and then they come up with all sorts
Yes.
of explanations for how they figured it out, and that turns into a crazy religion, and then it collapses.
Yeah. One of the best written history books I've read is James Scott's Against the Grain. James Scott, as a conservative populist, James Scott's one of those leftist populists I read, and I agree with him on almost everything. Where there's like this certain horseshoe where there's this like shoe on head hippie Russell Brand's type of leftist. You could put me in a room with them and we'd agree on most stuff. And
Yeah.
James Scott's one of those guys, and he he wrote a book about the origin of agriculture in Mesopotamia, and there's a couple really interesting threads. The first is that the region had a climate like Florida at the time, which is ridiculous. It was this huge swamp, and the Middle East was wet. And the agriculture was invented as this sort of part-time system in the swamplands to get extra nutrition. And then as the region dried out, because the drying out of the Sahara and of Arabia due to changes in monsoon patterns around 3000 BC is the thing that started both Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization. And what happened is that as they dried out, they had to default onto agriculture to survive. And what happened over time, and the thesis he keeps pulling on, is that slavery was instrumental to the rise of agriculture. Because he said is that societies that had stable agricultural fields had larger military advantages, but then they didn't have an incentive to do it. And so his thesis is that they were basically slave colonies where they would take people and then make them agriculturalized to gradually domesticate them. And then over time, they would gain a greater and greater military advantage.
So that's one way to get your hunter-gatherer population on board with transitioning to farming is use slaves.
Yeah. There's so frontier cultures tend to either prioritize freedom or slavery as a principle. So black slavery and democracy in America, serfs and Cossacks in Eastern Europe. And I would imagine it's true with the invention of agriculture as well. And it's one of the things political scientists talk about is that Westerners, when they think about the origin of societies, we project our origin because the West is the only society that operates under a social contract. And the social contract is the idea that you make a deal with the government, that the government takes care of you in exchange for you paying them taxes. That's feudalism. That was a side effect of the fall of Rome and the fall of the Frankish Empire. It only happened in Western civilization. And Francis Fukuyama and James Scott and Will Durant cover this really well, where in the Middle Eastern world, it was theocracy, where what happened in Mesopotamia is a really easy example, because Mesopotamia, as their civilization formed, their founding myth was that the gods hated them. And imagine you go from a Florida climate to an Arizona climate. Because South Iraq now is super dry. You would definitely think the gods hated you. And so you would desperately try to appeal to the gods to stop the horrifying collapse of your ecosystem so that you would give the priest class a tremendous amount of power, which is why in the Middle Eastern world, the origins of their social structure started out as theocracies thousands of years ago, and they're still theocracies today. Iraq and Iran and Egypt are still socially theocracies.
Interesting. And then I guess that gets back with theocracies and the social contracts we should probably cover, since we brought it up, people might be wondering, what could kill us? We covered what
Yes.
killed them.
So I'm going to use the Fitzpatrick's War playbook here, where Fitzpatrick's War is a sci-fi novel set in the 25th century with the rise of an American Alexander the Great. And in the book series over the course of the 21st century, and this book was written like 1990, the world's population goes from 11 billion to 1 billion. And it happens due to a combination of genetically engineered plagues, supply chain issues, breakdown in the global energy system, and global famines and war, where the book talks about America spirals into a multi-decade civil war where the Republican Party becomes run by intentional communities of people fleeing the city's degeneracy, living in rural societies together, and they're run by a secret social club of historians who use the cycles of history to engineer America's future. They're called the Yukons. The rednecks burn the cities down, and the Democrat Party becomes attached to corrupt ethnic minority gangs that use racial politics. And basically the rednecks burn the cities down, and America becomes it becomes an Anglo-Saxon mixed monarchy with a parliament, a house of nobility, basically a military warrior caste, and a king with weak power.
And you're telling me that wouldn't lead to population growth?
Yeah, they purposely cap population growth. You're only allowed to have 2 kids so that it doesn't result in overpopulation and the lowering of quality of life. And with the Chinese populate East Asia and the Muslims populate Europe. So that's the Fitzpatrick's War world. I agree with that. The things that could crush our populations, supply chain issues. No one gets how bad supply chain issues can be. It's just one of those things that could kill literally 5 billion people immediately. Supply chain issues, genetically engineered diseases or not genetically engineered diseases, nuclear war, issues with fertilizer or oil. Wars today could kill so many people. If an American Civil War, if we're following the historic record, could easily kill 100 million people if it goes on for long enough and there's enough supply chain issues. Because the Hundred Years' War killed 2/3 of France's population, the 30 Years' War killed a third of Germany's population. Like a single war, if it lasts long enough and there's supply chain issues, can kill like 120 million people. I have a buddy who runs statistical sets who said that if there was a 1 month breakdown in all supply chains, 90 million people would die. I don't believe that, but if you expand that to a year, I think it could be 90 million.
Right. And it's often a kind of a static view because you're not seeing how the supply chain adapts. But
Yeah.
when you're talking about war, that's the real situation in which you could have a real escalating um, situation.
Yes.
Basically, I think it's war and revolution from not adapting the system are what would be most likely to cause the biggest problems.
I think plague. Keep in mind, plague
Right.
easily
That.
killed 20 times as many people in history as war. Where there's a great book called Plagues and Peoples by McNeill, which is a history of world history through plague. And it makes you realize every single element of human history has been colored by plague. And
Right.
the numbers are so horrifying, where, the bloodiest war in human history was World War II that killed 65 million people. And the invention of Malarone, anti-malaria medicine, has saved at least 1 billion lives. The invention of clean water has also saved at least 1 billion lives. So just the scale when you're dealing with health stuff is so much vaster than war. And when you think of how few people wars kill, it gives us more slack as a species.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking with high-tech weapons and the supply chain angle. And then disease, we do have control over that with innovation a bit. But that can also hit
Yeah.
you out of nowhere. I guess in terms of the ones that are super in our control, the key factor is the system is too complex to deconstruct. You're
Yes.
not going to deconstruct it. It's either all the way through to space or a complete loss of momentum.
Genetically engineered plagues are one of my biggest worries because we
Mhm.
already have them. Where the Soviets made a version of the Black Death they were going to drop on America that antibiotics wouldn't work against. And once you let loose that, it's never going back. Um, and in Fitzpatrick's War, the genetically engineered plagues are the thing that kills the most people. And I think over the next 500 years, we're going to drop at least one of those. And if it kills like half the population, that would be historically normal. Um, Nuclear war is another one. I'm really happy we haven't had a nuclear war. As of now, our nuclear arsenals are actually really poorly maintained. Most of them wouldn't work, and our missile defense system, THAAD, is also pretty effective. I can't believe a boomer named it THAAD. That's hilarious. But nuclear war used to kill like 2 billion people. Now we're at 300 million. Progress.
Oh, interesting. And why is
Yeah.
that? Because
So,
we got more precise or something, better supply chains?
the amount of nukes America and Russia had radically decreased after the end of the
Oh,
Cold War. Also, our missile heads are really poorly maintained, so most wouldn't work. And we're at the point where THAAD or a missile defense system can knock at least half of nukes out of the sky. We've also changed our nuclear doctrine, where beforehand the doctrine was we need to have so many bombs that we destroy every single secondary and tertiary city so that even if half the bombs fail, we have enough bombs to make them suffer so much. And now we've moved to a different kind of less aggressive doctrine, which isn't as focused on basically just complete detonation.
right. More precise, trying to find a way to get control out of the
Yeah.
situation.
I'm I'm not
That's
worried about nuclear war. It's just
mhm.
one of like people have said, Rudyard, should I stress about nuclear war? And I don't worry about I don't think World War III is going to happen either, if I'm
Yeah,
honest.
I agree with you.
So
Like we said, it's more like the 1600s, but that might
agreed.
be too off topic.
So let's actually talk about ancient Europe, although I'm sure the audience loves this stuff. But the Europe during the last ice age, glaciers went as far south as Paris and Poland. And then over time, as the glaciers cleared out, Europe started to attain a geography more like today, although there were key differences. There was a time when the Black Sea and the Caspian were connected. The Baltic used to be way bigger. There was a time when the Black Sea was land. And the Black Sea was actually one of the most fertile places in the world that experienced flooding within a week that filled up the entire Black Sea due to the Dardanelles Strait opening up. And we think this is the origin of the biblical flood myth, because the flooding of the Black Sea, which again occurred in less than a week, it is the impetus that resulted in the populating of Europe, because the Black Sea was populated by these Neolithic farmer types where agriculture started in the Middle East and then it spread out to Europe. And as said before, it was a process of genocide where the Middle Eastern ethnic people replaced the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Europe, who themselves, as I said before, Ice Age Europe had experienced 7 previous genocides of populations mostly coming out of Siberia and Central Asia. And they had in turn replaced the Neanderthals, who were a humanoid species that we bred with in Europe. And an interesting fact here is that the population with the most Neanderthal ancestry in the world is the Chinese, even though the Neanderthals are from modern Europe. The Chinese and the Chinese and the New Guineans are the most Neanderthal population in the world, even though Neanderthals are from the area of modern Europe. The reason is that Europe has been genocided so many times that there's not that much relation between the people who first bred with the Neanderthals and the current Europeans, because the ancestors of the current Europeans came from Egypt originally. And then, which is actually in Celtic mythology, they said that their ancestors came out of Egypt. But the Neolithic farmers genocided the population of old Europe. And as I said before, this was a difficult process where you had the Scandinavians who fought back. Right. And we don't think the Neolithic farmers ever made it into Scandinavia, but they were the builders of Stonehenge. And there was this very advanced society in Western Europe 4,000 years ago that we know nothing about, where this was a culture that spanned the Atlantic coast with populations in France, the British Isles. They were centered culturally in the British Isles. And you have these beautiful Neolithic constructions like Skara Brae or Stonehenge or Newgrange or Carnac, and their spiritual center was in the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland, which is pretty far north. And Stonehenge was built roughly the same time as the pyramids, which is really, really old. Something to keep in mind is that we are closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was the builder of the pyramids. So when Alexander the Great, the pyramids were already so old that they were seen as mythical in his time. And so there was this society, and they were genetically basically Italians. Sardinians are nearly 100% genetically identical to the Neolithic farmer inhabitants of Europe. And the further south you go into Europe, the more Neolithic ancestry, and the further north, the more Aryan. And the great irony is that for the builders of Stonehenge, they are genetically vastly closer to Italians than are the current inhabitants of the British Isles. The current British Isles people are 90% basically people who came from the Aryan invasions. And
so you're saying the Roman invasions of England were just a homecoming?
They were, yeah. And it's really remarkable how little we know about the mound builders, because clearly they were relatively advanced, because for Stonehenge, they were doing incredibly strong mathematical calculations relating to astrology. And they were able to get things really down, where, for example, in Newgrange, a Neolithic site in Ireland, they structured it so that on the solstice, the sun would immediately light up the entire tomb area, and on no other day would that happen. And they were taking these huge multi-ton stones from 200 miles away at Stonehenge, and they were bringing some other stones for the spiritual areas from the north of Scotland. And there were these trade networks that spanned the whole Atlantic coast from 4,000 years ago. And Europe was a very ocean-based culture. A tremendous amount of their calories from the archaeology we've looked at came from seafood. And there was a lot of some of the largest hunter-gatherer populations in the world were in Northwest Europe due to fishing, because fishing and clams and that stuff was such a huge source of calories. And in Scandinavia, the hunter-gatherers held on longer than anywhere because the fishing and the hunting was good enough that you didn't need to be a farmer.
Right. And I guess they just had also the isolation. The areas weren't as competitive for farmland. Um,
Exactly. And there are several other societies where we have the mound builders in the northwest of Europe that we know nothing about, and it's really crazy. We don't even know. So language is one of the things that gets preserved the longest for a conquered people, where, for example, Native Americans make up less than 0.5% of modern America's genetics, and most states in the country have a Native American name. For the and rivers are the place that has the most. A river is most likely to keep the old names from the old society, because whenever explorers go to a place, they follow the rivers and they ask the native population what the name of the river is. We have almost no pre-Aryan names in Europe. There's a handful like Iberia or Navia in Scandinavia is one part of the name Scandinavia is indigenous, but we don't know almost anything about them. We have no names about them. The only few remnants is that the later conquerors called the indigenous inhabitants fairies or dryads or pixies. The myths of the elves or the dwarves or the fairies or the dryads stem from the indigenous populations who basically got immortalized as mythical creatures, where it would be as if we would see Native American spirits, and Native Americans would gradually become mythical creatures to us. And so they called the Neolithic stone spear points in Ireland, they called them fairy points.
right. Right. I was just going to say there's the Irish ferry connection.
Yeah.
Um, and
In
are they more, you said they're more indigenous European than other areas, but you said Basque is the same genetically as Spain. So is
yeah.
there a real difference in Ireland, or are they all pretty
It's a
much?
north-south gradient. Aryans are, according to the current results, the most Aryan population in the world, and I will hold on to that genetics result as long as possible.
Oh,
Where
Ireland is the most
Yeah,
Aryan.
Ireland. So the genetics results change really quickly. This is one of
Right.
those things where you should have very little faith in genetics results because every 5 years they change so rapidly. Where there was lots of genetic science 20 years ago, that's just completely ridiculous now. And it's but we're getting way better, and so the results we have now should stick more because we're operating with really small sample sizes. In the older tests, the most Aryan populations in the world are the Muslim Tatar populations of Russia and Finnish people, which are ironically don't speak Aryan languages. The current results make it this arc of territory where Scandinavians, Irish, British, some Russians. The further north you get, more Aryan ancestry, and then once you're like Sardinia, Sicily, South Spain, it's mostly native ancestry. And so Europe is this north-south gradient from Aryan to
Anatolian.
Neolithic ancestry, and then towards the west, like 10% of the population is hunter-gatherers.
Right, right. Got it.
And there's another society we should probably talk about, that being there's some evidence that there was a civilization which would be one of the oldest in the Balkans, where this is one of those things where there's not a lot of really trustworthy. We don't trust some of the Yugoslav archaeology involved, which was done to boost Serbian nationalism. But we have records that they might have there's building these huge mounds, and in Ukraine, we have hundreds of miles of ditches, lines of ditches, and these huge mounds that required a tremendous amount of effort. And we have these large megalithic constructions in Serbia, and there's some evidence, I don't know how much I trust, that they had their own written code, and this was like 3000 BC. There's some evidence, I don't know how much I trust it. I would need to read a lot more that suggests that the Balkans might have one of the oldest civilizations in the world.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of the oldest kind of places are out in Eastern Europe. I'm not as familiar with.
Yeah, Eastern Europe's one of those places in history that was really done dirty by no one ever reading its history. Like, as far as most histories could say, Eastern Europe might have never existed. And the big event we've been alluding to is the Aryan invasions. And we have a whole video on the Aryan invasions. You can watch it. But the Aryans are a population that has 100 different names used for them to get around the Nazi connection, like the Yamnaya, the Kurgan, the Andronovo, the corded ware people. And people get stuck in a lot of really complex names because this is a field with too many academics and not enough public intellectuals. And whenever that happens, the names get autistic and stupid. Where I said this before in a previous video, I had a debate with a geneticist. We were talking about steppe ancestry, and I thought he was saying Aryan ancestry, which is from the steppe. And then he said, no, steppe is a certain genetic subcomponent for this very specific subregion. I said, make up a new fucking name then. Don't use the same term for 5 things. And the big current, because people talk about the corded ware culture or they talk about the bell beaker culture, is the Aryans pushed west. And the Aryans started in Ukraine, and they invented the chariot and a more aggressive form of warfare. And they just smashed across the European continent, crushing the local population. And it was genocide further north, and they enserfed the population further south. And the only people in the world who don't speak an Aryan language are the only indigenous people are the Basques in this small region between France and Spain. And the Iberians held out last. You had non-Aryan populations in Iberia, I think as late as like 500 BC. And the Aryan invasions completely changed the culture of Europe because you move from a more theocratic farmer society where Bronze Age pervert took the term longhouse from the pre-Aryan populations of Europe because they would build these huge longhouses and live in them. And the assumption was always that these were feminized societies. And that fits because the Aryans crushed them so hard. I mean, if your society are men, fight back. But also, every farming society in the ancient world was a theocracy because you were scared that you're completely dependent on the elements. And
You're very vulnerable, like we talked about earlier,
yes,
versus the hunter-gatherers can move. Here you're just, yeah.
exactly, yes. And so we know that they were a theocracy, and also when they're building Stonehenge and they're making tiny mathematical calculations or the exact type of radius for the sun, you know this is a theocracy. And the Aryans wiped that culture off the face of the earth, and they built this more warlike, militarized culture, where McNeill said you went from the megalith to the castle, because the Aryans replaced the old constructions with these iron hill forts. In the west of Europe, in the ancient period, had these big hill forts, and it was really difficult for the Romans to crush them because the Romans kept on having to take all these different hill forts like Alesia to drive the Celts to conquer Western Europe from the Celts. And he moved from a Bronze Age culture to an Iron Age culture, where this is an important distinction. And the Aryans seeded this aggressive masculine culture across Eurasia, from the whole region they conquered from Ireland to Bengal. And it was the Aryan idea is that a single man can challenge the universe. And in India, this was taken into religion, where the Indian mystic approach actually uses a similar psychological system as Greek philosophy. It's just applied to subjective mysticism. And in Europe, it was applied to science and philosophy. And you don't see that kind of edgy angstiness against the universe in other societies like China or Egypt, because in those societies you are at one with nature, and that's not the attitude the Aryans had. And with that, you saw the Iron Age is also important because it moved from a more aristocratic to a more egalitarian system. The invention of iron across the world moved from chariot armies to sword armies, and that caused a mass democratization and social change from it. And so you saw the rise of these warrior cultures, and some of these were more advanced than people think. For example, I'm going to go back to the Bronze Age, but there was this really advanced late Bronze Age Baltic culture that everyone forgets about, where it was based around Scandinavia and Germany and North Poland. And they make these beautiful gold inlaid cart pieces of art, and they have these huge ships and the bog bodies were in Denmark. They would throw human sacrifice to people in a bog. And one time when I was in Denmark, we were in that museum, and then my mom made me shut up for a minute. We said, "Honor your ancestors. These people are your ancestors." And um, it's there was that Bronze Age culture, and there was the Battle of Toland in northeast Germany, which we think was one of the biggest battles in ancient European history, where we dug up this battle and it was thousands of people, hundreds of chariots, and it's all nations we forgot about. So we know there was this huge battle in northeast Germany 4,000 years ago with all these countries we know nothing about.
That's insane. And it seems like larger battles than you even had throughout the medieval period, kind of like in antiquity, you had those
Yeah,
large
yeah.
battles. So what's behind that? And how does it connect to the big warlords that had an outsized share of genetic distribution?
I'm just looking up. It's not the. I don't think it's the Battle of Toland. I'm looking up Bronze Age Baltic battle. It was this shift of culture to a more aggressive society, and what you saw was the establishment of an example of this actually is in Norse mythology. Okay, it's the Battle of Toland's River, and it took place in 1250 BC. Um, they say this is one of the biggest battles in ancient European history. But in Norse mythology, for example, you moved from the god of fertility being the dominant god to the god of strategy being the dominant god, and that signifies a social shift from a farming to a warrior culture. And beforehand, it was the god of the. Ironically, both Odin and the older god were the god of the forest because Europe was all trees at this point. And so you got to revere the forest because everything's the forest. And the Romans write about marching for over a week straight and never seeing the end of the German forest. And the forest just going on forever, driving people mad with how huge it is. And the Germans lived in these tiny outcrops in the forest.
Is
And
that like the Tolkien elf myths where the
it is,
forests
yeah.
are so big you get lost in them if you stray off the path? And
Yeah, exactly.
interesting.
And so with the warrior culture in Norse culture, for example, the way you get into heaven was to die in battle gloriously. And Odin is interesting because Odin's a god of strategy, not a god of war. Because Ares, for example, is the force of ferocious battle. When the Greeks talk about being captured by Ares, they talk about just bloodlust. And Odin is primarily a god. He is this weird combination of mystic strategy where he both owns the tree of life, which is the ability to mystically go from heaven to hell, while he also is the god of military strategy and diplomacy and cunning and that stuff. Before he's a god of war per se, but with with the Iron Age culture, you saw the Celts rise to dominance of Europe, where the Celts started out in the Alpine region, where the first large area of Celtic culture was Hallstatt. And the Celts are often called the Hallstatt culture. And the Celts were the vanguard that pushed across Western Europe, where the Celtic speakers today are uh, western parts of the British Isles and Brittany and France. And beforehand, Celts went all the way from, they got out to like Turkey, they got out to central Turkey, Romania, Ukraine, and then out into Spain and Western Europe. They had most of Europe at a certain point. And there's a lot of waffling about this topic where the thing that made the most sense to me is that the Celts were just the first people to spread across Western Europe. And then there's other arguments that there were multiple waves of migration, like the corded ware and the bell beaker peoples and that stuff. And it just seems elaborately complicated for me. Where it may happen, I don't know. There were a lot of wars then, but then to constantly talk about, because what they're doing is they're looking at pottery styles and they're saying that that's a unique culture that had to conquer another culture.
Mm,
Um, and it like you can change a pottery style and still have the same fundamental population. And what we
yeah.
see genetically is that there was a huge wave with the Celts conquering Western Europe, genociding the population, and there might have been some after, but it wasn't anything near the same scale.
Right. Basically, it's just a microcosm of what happened in England, where the Celts came in first and then the Anglo-Saxons came in, but they're
Yes,
both different waves of Indo-European migration.
exactly, yes. And so looking at the map in 500 BC of Europe, because 500 BC is the axial age, and I talk about there's the 40-degree axis, and the 40-degree axis is the place that civilization started, where in 500 BC, civilizations concentrated in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean area around greater Greece, like South Italy, Greece, Turkey. Then you have India and China. It clusters around 40 degrees north of the latitude of Philadelphia. Then around 1000 AD, you saw civilization expand to northwest Europe, Sahelian Africa, Central Asia, Japan, Southeast Asia. And so 500 BC, at the axial age, is an important historic moment. The Celts dominate most of Europe. The Celts dominate the British Isles, they dominate France, northern Italy around Milan, about half of Spain concentrated in the northwest. They're in the south of Poland, most of Germany, the Alps, Romania, Hungary, and the Celts in parts of Ukraine too, and parts of Poland. And the Celts went out, they conquered regions of Turkey. And so the Celts were a terrifying military force, where the Greeks and the Romans both wrote about fighting the Celts. And for both the Macedonians and the Romans, historians have theorized that their empires formed to fight off against the Celts, because the Celts were constantly butting up against both Italy and the Greeks, where the Celts sacked Delphi in Greece, and they also fought for mercenaries in Egypt. And the Celts also burned down most of Rome except for the top of the hill in 410 under the
Right.
leader Brennus, where Brennus is known for saying woe to the vanquished because he was going to take a certain amount of gold from the Romans to leave them alone. And he took the gold and he took more and said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Woe to the vanquished."
He did
And
a Darth Vader deal, basically.
exactly, yes. And the Macedonians and the Romans had to develop their military abilities because they had to find a way to short circuit the Celtic charge. Because the Celtic strategy was they'd get a bunch of guys and they just use fanatical courage to ram their enemies and knock them out. And the Celts were known for charging naked into battle with long swords and woad, and they're covered in blue paint. And this would shatter almost everyone, but the Macedonians and the Romans had to get really advanced infantry formations to negate the Celts' advantage. And they were terrified of the Celts. They keep on talking about how the Celts were super tall because they would say that the Celts and the Germans are a foot taller than we are as Mediterraneans. And the Romans and the Macedonians got their phalanx and their legions down to fight the Celts because there were multiple times where they nearly got wiped out by them.
That makes a lot of sense. 'Cause I saw someone complain on one of the other videos, the English video, about how, hey, the Picts and the Scots, they were actually invading us before we conquered them. They never really talk about that.
Yeah.
And it's very similar to the Roman scenario, where they were actually pushing down into Greece and Italy for a long time before
Yeah.
Caesar strolled through the other
Yeah.
direction.
The Celtic social structure was they were a warrior tribal people. And in Ireland, for example, this was a real issue in Irish culture was that if you were a noble family for 3 generations, that was what mattered. And if you lost one generation of being nobility, you slid out of being the nobility. And so Ireland had this mass social instability because their structure for what nobility was so fluid that there was constant fighting and killing over who got to be in nobility. In Irish culture, they say every man is king of his own hill. And they say that in Ireland, every man's a king, where there or everyone in Ireland can claim to be some kind of nobility. And so,
Well, that's like the guy in Braveheart when he
yeah,
shows up and says he's the King of Ireland. That's kind of a funny movie reference, but also it seems like maybe the origin of King Castle Doctrine or King of your own castle
yeah, exactly.
in your
That
house.
king of your own castle is the Scots Irish brought that to America. And it's part of the reason the Celts kept losing, because the Celts dominated in the era when their military prowess with long swords could crush their enemies. And then once more organization was needed militarily, they got squeezed by both the Romans and the Germans, who were better organized. And even in the last few centuries, the Scots and the Irish inability to unify is what hurt them against the English. And the Celts had their warrior leadership structure, where men of charisma would rise to power and then give out gifts to others in exchange for following them, and they'd form war bands. And the Celtic priest class were the Druids, and the Druids maintained trees, and they thought trees were sacred, and they viewed the world through life force flowing through people. And they, in Celtic culture, nudity was seen as a religious thing. And it was also a culture where we were attached to the force of life. And the more gloriously you died in battle, the more glorious your reincarnation was. And so in the culture, there was a natural incentive structure so that you would fight ferociously, so that you could reincarnate into something better, because they saw life and death. So the Hindus saw life's continual recurrence as a curse, and the Celts saw it as a great thing.
Very stoic. This is an
It is.
opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and so in 500 BC, the Germans were in Scandinavia and the Netherlands and centered around Denmark. And they had just started forming, and they were originally a swamp people. And the Germans gradually pushed the Celts down, where the Celts faced this two-tiered pressure, with one part coming up from the Romans, where it took the Romans a long time to unify Italy. And the Romans actually had to genocide modern Milan, because that area was Gallic, or the Gauls are the Celtic inhabitants of modern France. So they had to genocide the area around Milan and bring in Roman settlers to pacify it. And the Romans only really started fronting up against the Celts around 100 BC, which is also when the German migrations were really getting carried out. And the Greeks had a bunch of city-states in Western Europe. Marseille was originally Massalia, a Greek city-state. Same thing with Barcelona, which was Tarraconensis. And um, and Marseille was built around trading with the Celts, and the Roman authors would talk about how the Celts grew degenerate through trading with the Greeks. They would drink too much wine, they would have too many luxuries, and the Romans said they could conquer the Celts due to the Celts growing degenerate due to Roman luxury. And Dan Carlin talks about there's this Overton window where once you get civilized enough, you can have a well-organized military that gives you the advantages of being civilized. Then if you're barbaric enough, you have the innate savagery that comes from hard living. And there's ways to square this where you can combine the innate savagery with the organization, or you can combine the degeneracy with the lack of organization. And the Celts were stuck between the Germanic barbarians, who were more ruthless and more tough and more primitive, versus the Romans, who are more advanced. And so um, the Romans took Gaul in the final century BC under the leadership of Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar was part of the Roman trinity of leadership, and he needed to conquer territory in order to get money to try to launch himself as dictator of Rome. And so Caesar single-handedly conquered Gaul, and that was incredibly difficult, because Gaul had a bigger population than Italy did. And the Gauls also weren't primitive. They had a level of development roughly comparable to the Romans, where Gaul had cities, it had a writing system, it had an advanced priest class, was militarily very good. And Julius Caesar only barely conquered Gaul, even though Julius Caesar's one of the best military commanders in human history. And he was taking the Romans, one of the best militaries in history. And Caesar waged a multi-part war that started due to the German invasion, because the Germans had coming down from Scandinavia, and the Germans completely replaced the Celts east of the Rhine. So modern Germany and out into Eastern Europe, where there was a point around the time of the Roman period when all of Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Hungary were populated by German peoples. This was a big part of Hitler's Drang nach Ost, because he said we were in Eastern Europe before the Slavs were, which is factually true, actually. The Slavs were living in north, the Belarus Ukraine region in the Pripyat Marsh. And the Slavs only populated East Europe with the fall of Rome, or after the fall of Rome, but you had German populations out even in the Caucasus. The Alan peoples of the modern from the Caucasus originally, they were a German Iranic ethnic mix.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that all those areas, North Africa, it all gets mixed up. I mean, part of the Celts thing was weren't they working with the Phoenicians? Weren't there Iberian
Yes.
cults? And they had even a maritime, long-term maritime struggle with the Romans.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, then they had that whole Atlantic trade network, like we talked about, which was a really sophisticated, multi-thousand-year-old trade network that the Rome was never able to interface with because of that
Yes.
choke point between Spain and Africa, North Africa. And
The
there was the Canary Current there off the coast. And there's an interesting story about some Iberian Celts who were
hmm,
fighting maybe with the Phoenicians. And when the Phoenicians finally lost, there was some migration, and they found a uh, cattle copper axe in the Amazon
huh.
2,000 years ago. And it could be where all our stories of going off the edge of the world come from,
That's
because there was a
insane.
long period where you had the sailing technology to make it all the way, to America. Because if you went 50 miles off the coast of North Africa, you'd get caught in the Canary Current. And then you're
Yes.
not coming back. You're literally getting sucked off the edge of the earth.
Yes.
Most people
Interesting.
that happen to probably disappeared, but there could be some
Yeah.
traces.
I know we have some evidence of the Phoenicians going to the Amazon and going to Brazil, but so the Phoenicians, who were a Lebanese trading people based out of Tunisia, they were trading with Britain all the time because they needed to get tin from Britain's
Right.
tin mines in the Scilly Islands. And we know that there was a Greek explorer from Marseille called Pythias. He sailed as far as Norway and Iceland. So people were interfacing with Northwest Europe at this time. And there was the amber trade route as well, where the area around the Baltic Sea with Germany and Poland produced amber that they traded down to the Mediterranean. And amber was such a big part of fashion that even in the Bronze Age, in the Middle East, in places like Babylon or Egypt, they were getting amber from Poland and Germany and Scandinavia.
Yeah, and there was the amber room in Russia. It
Hmm.
was one of the most precious minerals back in the day. Maybe the balance has shifted because it's easier for us to gather it relative to other ones. But
Yeah.
that's a real area I like to focus on in the Neolithic is all the mines.
Hmm.
Because it's probably maybe we talked about these other things that can wipe you out, but it's probably the first example of like industrial town getting wiped out
Yeah.
kind of dynamic. Because could you imagine just exploring and then coming across like an exposed turquoise blue copper vein on a rock above the surface, which were all stripped,
Hmm.
at least 2,000 years before now. And then you would start mining it. A whole town would develop around it. Maybe it would be
Yeah.
100 years, 200, maybe a few, maybe more.
Hmm.
And then it would dry up. There's a lot of ancient mines that dried up thousands of years ago or were revisited with new
Interesting.
technology.
Yeah. Were there big copper mines around the Baltic?
Copper mines were pretty much not everywhere. Even copper mines were really far apart. It was still rare. It was still a big deal when you got one, but
Yeah.
they were generally dispersed. The tin mines were really rare, and that kind of England became known for those, or the
Yeah.
UK and Ireland.
I read this book called The Baltic Origins of Homer's Tales, and it's by an Italian guy called Vinny. And the thesis of the book is that the Homeric stories are actually set in the Baltic Sea. And I don't actually believe it, but the book is really well researched, so I respect the author's take. And he looks at all of these archaeological sites in the Bronze Age in the Baltic, and he compares how the story of the Iliad matches up with them better than the Aegean region. And the thing that he talks about is that there was a migration from the Baltic down to Greece after the time between the time of the Iliad and the time of Homer. And I know that the Dorians came from further north down into Greece, but I don't think they came from the Baltic initially. Um, There's there's another population we haven't talked about, which are the Scythians, and the Scythians are really cool. And the Scythians were an Iranic people who lived in a region stretching from Romania and Ukraine out to Western China and down to India. And the Scythians were known as one of those brutal fighters of the ancient world. And for example, Cyrus the Great was considered the greatest king of the ancient world. He was killed by a group of Scythians called the Masagatai, whose leader Tamiris killed him. And the Scythians were seen as they were seen as manly barbaric people who were also degenerates, where the Greeks said the Scythians were the worst drunks in the world, and they also smoked weed, and they were ethnically completely white. We've done genetics of Scythians, and white people are the indigenous inhabitants of Central Asia, where there are mummies from 3,000 years ago in Western China that have genetics like British people, and red
Right, red
hair, and
hair
they
and everything.
red hair, they wear tartan, that stuff. And there was this gradual replacement of the white populations in Central Asia around the time of the Roman Empire. Um, but the Scythians were seen as this huge military threat. And again, the Persians were the greatest army of, or the greatest empire of this time period. And the Persians invaded the Scythian territory twice, once through Turkmenistan and through Central Asia, take out the Masagatai, and another time through the Black Sea region, around through the Balkans, up through Ukraine, where we forget the Persians launched an invasion of Ukraine that got pretty far in. And both times, the Scythians completely slaughtered the Persian armies. And this is one of the very few times the Persians lose alongside the Greeks. And there's this story from both wars, or one of the wars rather than the others. So this story is from Tamiris with the Masagatai in Turkmenistan, is they shot and brought a frog, a fish, a frog, a bird, and another animal to the Persian king, and they said, "We can kill you if you walk, swim, or fly." And they killed Cyrus the Great, which was
Right. So
Cyrus
there's
the
no
Great.
escape, basically, they said.
Yes, and Cyrus the Great initially wanted to marry Tamiris, and she said no, and they killed him, which is crazy because Cyrus the Great was such a Chad. He conquered an area wider across than America single-handedly from India to Greece and Egypt. So he lost to the Scythians, and uh, a lot of authors from like 200 years ago were obsessed with the Scythians. I don't know why. Like lots of Napoleonic era authors use the Scythians as synonymous for badass, or they call the Russians Scythians. Um, and so the three big constellations of non-classical Europe or beyond Greece and Rome were Celtic, Germanic, and Scythian. Iberia was its own thing. There were the Celt-Iberians and the local population. And then Northeast Europe was super lightly populated. The Slavs hadn't settled down to full-time agriculture by this point. The Baltic peoples, the Finns, were not full-time agriculture. Assume the population of Eastern Europe was super low at this point. And over time, what you saw was the Romans taking the South region, and the Romans even conquered England, which is really weird, and they pushed up to the Rhine frontier with France and Spain, and then the Germans filled out the rest. So you saw the shrinking of Celtic territory as you saw this stable frontier emerge between the Romans and the Germans.
And that kind of brings us into the more modern situation,
Yes.
this stabilizing. And then I guess I wonder, isn't this big Neolithic period where um, so you have Genghis Khan or different people where they can trace them back to being the people
Yes.
who had the largest genetic impact, and 8 out of the 10 top figures we don't know. And do
Yes.
they come kind of from this period we're talking
They
about?
do. So, with genetic analysis, 8 out of the 10 people with the biggest genetic analyses, with the biggest genetic impacts, are people who we don't know their existence. And most of them are concentrated in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. But we have some from the Bronze Age where in the Bronze Age transition, you had these Chads who just slept with hundreds of women, life goals, and impregnated hundreds of women, life goals. And it was this real transition period where I would imagine some conqueror gets a tribe and he just said, yeah, every single girl in this tribe, I'll just go impregnate her, and her husband has to take care of it now.
So is a transition period between bronze and iron, or
Yeah, that's what we think. We think it came
okay,
about due to a transition period between bronze and iron, and it's also a herder people. Because when herder peoples conquer farming peoples, they just fuck all the women.
right? Which is a very Genghis Khan dynamic where they just
Yes.
ran roughshod over everybody, and
So we've studied the populations that descend from Genghis Khan, and then we basically have a look at what Genghis Khan's type was. Genghis Khan did not sleep with very many Chinese women. His type were mostly Uyghurs and Central Asians.
could you say Genghis Khan was the fourth Aryan invasion, but it just failed?
Genghis
Not
Khan wasn't an Aryan. He was,
right. Yeah, but like from the area, I
yeah,
guess
yeah, he was, so
the steppe.
yeah, Genghis Khan, um, the last steppe migration was Tamerlane, and you can count the Manchus. The Manchus are kind of honorary. They're from the Chinese forest region, but they're also horse barbarians. Um, the Manchus are the last, and then before that, Tamerlane, before that, Genghis Khan, and before that, the Seljuk Turks. But the steppe just keeps pumping out these people, and the Aryans were the first.
Right. And when did the Aryans not exist in the steppe anymore? And
So, the Scythians were genetically identical to the Aryans. The
mhm.
Scythians were just the Aryans of Central Asia. And um, basically, Ukraine stopped being white when Ukraine stopped being white around the medieval period when the Turks came in with the Cumans and the Pechenegs. But that was
uh,
a relatively short period, and then the Slavs populated modern Ukraine in the 18th century.
and the Slavs are not Indo-European.
Oh, the
They
Slavs
came.
are, they're white.
Okay, so it's all the same. Well,
You've
yeah, of
you've
course,
you've met
Ukraine, Russia, all
Russians,
that.
right?
Yeah, obviously.
Um,
Yeah.
and so now we've stabilized with the Roman period where the Romans tried to take Germany with Teutoburger Wald, which was the Romans had conquered everything west of the Elbe River, and they were trying to integrate it. And then one of their commanders, Arminius, betrayed them and then slaughtered an entire Roman field army in the forest. I really love Arminius. I aspire to be like him when I'm older, um, except in a peaceful way. Um,
Yeah, he was a cool
and
figure.
and he really saved Germany, and then in classic fashion, he tried to rise to become king of the Germans, then got killed by his own people. And Emperor Augustus, who was trying to conquer Germania, upon hearing he had an entire field army, and the Romans didn't lose battles, or almost never lost battles. This was horrifying. 15,000 men killed all in the forest of North Germany up by Denmark. He literally, in his palace, screamed for days, "Give me back my legions, Varus," where Varus was the commander.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of a big psychological loss too, and
It
also
was.
probably ties into the myth of the forest,
Exactly.
disappearing inside of it.
Yeah, the Romans saw Germany as just the edge of civilization. It was just a mythical place.
Yeah.
And Tacitus is the Roman equivalent of Rousseau or a leftist, where Tacitus would talk a lot about how the Romans were morally degenerate and the Germans were more moral than them. And so Tacitus used Germania as this example of this primal society. People are in tune with values. And one of the reasons the Germans beat the Romans in the fall of Rome era is that, for example, the Germans were very, very harsh on adultery. And if a woman adulterated, she would get stoned to death. And so there was more idea of paternity protection. And societies, my attitude towards this is that the thing that matters the most in social attitudes towards sex are paternity protection. I would put that above everything else for a sexual moral code.
And why did that make it difficult for the Romans? Because they couldn't like integrate into the royal families or marry
Oh,
in or
so societies with strong paternity protection, men fight harder because they know that if their wife's child will be theirs. And so you can correlate paternity protection with societal cohesion really strongly. The Romans were collapsing into moral degeneracy, and because Germany was this barbaric, lightly populated place, the Germans were less morally degenerate. And Roman authors would often talk about the vigor and the morality of the Germans while still thinking they were complete savages.
right. That's that funny kind of it's because one success in one dimension
Yeah,
creates a gap in another until you're able to integrate it.
facts.
But it creates a desire to kind of go back for the element you lost
Yes.
rather than integrate it into a cohesive future.
Anything else for this topic?
Um, just I guess to reiterate how crazy it would have been to be a Neolithic person and stumble upon a mineral mine,
Yes.
because that would just completely change the whole area and your lifestyle. And the wealth differences are kind of impossible to even articulate, like the trading potential that comes out of that. And then,
This was called investing in Bitcoin early.
yeah, exactly. And then, the tin was in Roman coins before they really even knew much about the area because you have
Yeah,
all the intermediaries.
yeah.
Um,
The Carthaginians kept the blockade of the Straits of Gibraltar, and so Pythias had to walk over the south of France to reach the Atlantic because the Carthaginians kept the Atlantic world on lock. And so they were getting tin from Britain before they barely even knew what Britain was.
right, exactly. And we kind of have this conception of Britain wasn't anything, but it was just blocked off. It was connected, but no.
Yeah, Britain had like 1 million people, which is the population it had in 1000 AD. Pre-industrial populations are relatively stable. Like Egypt had the same population in 3000 BC as it did in 1800. And I've heard some sources say that Britain had the same population in the Iron Age as it did right after the Black Death.
Wow, that's interesting.
Because their population halved with the Black Death, so they got back to
Right.
the Iron Age population level.
So you get a slow crawl with a couple halvings, and then you're
Yeah,
basically
exactly.
back to
So,
normal.
book recommendations.
Yes.
Ancestral Journeys by Jean Monco. It's a genetic history of Europe, pretty good. Who We Are and How We Got Here by David Reich. I would not recommend this book enough. Um, and I've got some other books in the Celts. I haven't read these yet, though. And Neil Oliver has got some interesting books on the prehistory of Europe. He has like a prehistoric history of Britain and that stuff. But with that out of the way, would you like to cover the Silk Road or pre-colonial Southeast Asia next?
Um, the Silk Road feels on theme. I know we've
Yeah.
been building up to Asia for a while though,
Yeah.
so maybe we can have another comments competition.
Okay, sounds good. Let's do the Silk Road.
All
Okay.
right, Silk Road it
Catch you
is.
next
Comments
time.
have decided already.
Bye.